isn't, or maybe it's not true, but isn't everyone somewhat anxious? Or when you say anxious people, like, is there like a spectrum of anxiety? How do whether you just have regular run of the mill normal anxiety or you're an anxious person?
Everybody has a healthy degree of anxiety to survive in the world, but when you're thinking about anxious attachment, it's about 25% of the population fall under that. And it is very different from avoidant, which also has anxiety. It just shows up differently, or secure, who has less anxiety. And that's not to say that a secure person can't have anxiousness in their relationships if they partner with someone who's really avoidant. But people with an anxious attachment system tend to be hyper focused on the external. They tend to have a deep rooted abandonment wound. The way in which they survive is to keep things stay close and plan. And sometimes they can appear controlling, even though they're just trying to kind of create some calmness in their world. They tend to sometimes have lower self-esteem and self-sacrifice and build resentment later on. And it's because they are externally focused and sometimes struggle with getting their own needs met internally, or even knowing what their own needs are, because when they were younger, they kind of became like good readers of the room or caretakers, or they're very empathic to other people's needs. So they overextend themselves externally and tend to abandon themselves a lot internally as a way to survive. And so they still do that romantically, and they end up saying, I'm in the same relationship with this narcissistic or selfish person. And it's a lot because they have these self-abandonment tendencies that they needed to have in order to survive as a child. And now they need to learn how to undo that.
When you said something that you said, I just think is so like lightning bolt moment, is you said you get really good at reading the room. And I think that happens so unconsciously, right? Like, talk more about what that looks like so that people can kind of like find their place inside that, because I think that people do that so naturally and unconsciously that they're not even realizing that that's part of an anxious attachment style.
That's such a good question. And I could geek out a little bit on the neuroscience.
Let's do it. I love geeking out on neuroscience.
We all have something called neuroception. It was a term coined by Dr. Stephen Porges, and it's inner and outer cues that send our body into a state of survival, fight, flight, freeze. And people with anxious attachment, it's also referred to as ambivalent attachment, have a hyper vigilance towards abandonment. So their amygdala and part of how they are consciously, subconsciously, or even unconsciously looking out for when they might be abandoned and when they might be left. So they're going to pick up on any cues around that. And they're just trying to prevent themselves from the feeling of abandonment that lives very deep inside themselves. So they become hyper vigilant of the external world to try to protect themselves.